it is time to get back into journal making. I actually still had a lot of this stuff packed away in boxes even though I moved like 5 months ago. I had to hunt down a bunch of my supplies thanks to my poor box labeling skills, but I finally found them all and I'm ready to get back into the swing of things, but this time with a new character in mind. While you watch me remind myself how my supplies work and do a couple of practice thumbnails, let me address why I am swapping characters. It's not that I want Inkashi's journal to end. I actually have a few more sessions worth of journaling content that I could make, just that the campaign that Inkashi is in is on a hiatus of undetermined and possibly indefinite length, which is the unfortunate reality of playing Dungeons and Dragons. You would think that the most unrealistic things about D&D is going to be the dragons, but actually what's even more unrealistic is thinking that all of your friends consistently have a schedule that lines up so you can play together. Like I said, I have maybe 3 to 5 pages of Inkashi journal that I could keep going through if y'all would be interested in seeing that. I do just feel bad continuing to generate hype for a story that I am not confident is going to ever pick back up again. Which is why, and hopefully with your blessing, I am passing the torch of the D&D journal from Inkashi to Fing. Many of you are very familiar with Fing already, but in case you're new to my channel or just happened to miss Fing along the way, Fing is my little yellow kobold Oath of the Crown paladin. But let's get into journaling. Just like in the last journal, I skipped the first 2 pages, partially because in this particular brand of sketchbook, the first 2 pages stick together in a really weird way, but also because I have been a little bit interested in book binding or rebinding. I really want to try it out someday, and especially on my D&D journals to make them look a little more fantasy accurate. So I'm leaving a couple extra pages at the start as a layer of protection between my anxiety of ruining existing art and my hubris of wanting to try a completely new hobby out of nowhere. Now, the very first page of this book doesn't actually have much to do with Fing's personal adventures, but it is very relevant to his character. On this page, I have written the Paladin Oath with specifically the tenets of the Oath of the Crown: law, loyalty, courage, and responsibility. I have written it in this very fancy and also illegible script to give off the vibe of an old-timey official document. When I designed Fing, I very intentionally planned for him to include the traits of someone who keeps a journal because I wanted to make more of these D&D journals, and with his backstory, I thought the best way to get a journal into his hands would be directly as a result of his paladin class. Much like in Kashti, we have a government-provided journal, but unlike in Kashti, Fing journals in a way that I would want to. Not that I didn't enjoy working on Inkashi's journal. Working on her journal, I ran into a lot of unexpected problems. Inkashi is a lot more centered around magic schematics, drawing architectural locations. She has very few paint colors in her palette because it would be an unnecessary expense. Her story also takes place in a desert, so my super fun collection of pressed North American wildflower stickers were not particularly relevant. Fing, on the other hand, loves bright colors. He would absolutely keep every interesting candy wrapper or weird stamp that he came across. He's always picking and pressing flowers. As you can clearly see, I was excited to make use of as many flower stickers as possible on this page. Alright, on to page 2, and I'm gonna try to be pretty quick about talking about the pages because I missed having a lot of time to make these journals, and given time, I ended up going a little bit hog wild and finished a bunch of journal pages. But in my defense, I have this many for a good reason, and you will see why by the time we get to around page number 8. I am doing something a little different for this journal. So Fing has been journaling since before he met his party, so for his journal it makes sense that it includes a little bit of his adventures from before he joined the campaign. Fing was nobody before he was picked up by a group of paladins traveling from a city called Caritania. At that point in time, Fing had very few interactions with anybody that wasn't either a wild creature or another kobold. Follow me down this tangent, I promise it makes sense. One of my earlier memories as a young child is of my mom sitting me down to teach me our home phone number, how to spell my last name, our address, the things you need to know as a wee babby that's about to go to school. And I don't blame my mom for not teaching me how to spell my own last name until I was 5 or 6 years old. It was Polish, 12 letters long. Very few non-Polish adults pronounced it right the first time. For the first page, I have a very first day of school style entry where the paladins are trying to teach Fing all this safety information. His name, his his age, his home. They've also written the info down for him to copy because he doesn't have the motor skills developed for writing in Common, let alone the ability to remember how to spell things in Common. And of course, he's drawn this very endearing picture of himself with one of his heavy armored friends and the very important corner sun. I also decided to glue an actual 4-leaf clover into this journal entry because, much like Fing, I enjoy pressing flowers. I have a penchant specifically for collecting 4-leaf clovers. I have very many 4-leaf clovers between the pages of a hefty book, specifically a book that is a collection of Jules Verne stories, because I don't know, it just felt like the right place to put them. But it's about time that they find a new and more permanent home, and I think it's very fitting to spend a few of these 4-leaf clovers on Fing's journal. The next page is a continuation of Fing's time learning with the paladins. So I cut out a long strip of paper to go on the right side of the page, and there I used my left hand to write Fing over and over and over as if he's learning his letters and practicing his handwriting. I gotta say, this was probably a great workout for my brain. It's actually almost a little concerning how far behind in dexterity my left hand is compared to my right hand. My left hand has the writing capability of an actual 4-year-old, so I would say that this is pretty lore accurate. I also wanted it to look like there were contributions from the other paladins in Fing's journal, especially in these early pages. So there are a lot of different art styles and text fonts through the various mediums and abilities that I have available to me. I sectioned off a portion of this page for me to do a little bit of watercolor. I wanted to paint a mountain scenery for one because according to the map that the DM has given us, Fing is from a place that is very far in the northwest corner of the continent, and he had to cross a pretty large mountain range in order to get where he is now. And for two, there were a lot of example videos on Pinterest for how to paint mountain ranges in watercolor. Despite that being the case and there being a plethora of examples on how to do that, I don't think I quite got it. I'm not really happy with my watercolor skills in this painting or throughout the project at all, but it's been a while, okay? And generally I don't think I'm that good at watercolor to begin with. For the 4th page, I had less of a story reason to make this page, and it was more that I saw someone else make a cool journal scrapbook page and I wanted to also do it. It does lean a little hard into the dark academia aesthetic, which isn't really Fing's vibe, but it sort of plays into the idea of mixed media and a lot of different art styles, as a lot of people contributed to these pages of the journal. Collage pages take a lot more planning in advance with paper placement and color, and while I really love how this page turned out, my entire collection of little papers and stickers are overall a very muted brown color, which typically works pretty well for what I'm going for, but in collages like this, they don't offer a lot of contrast, so it is hard to make a certain piece stand out from the rest, and it kind of makes the collage get a little muddy looking. In hindsight, I should have done a dark wash on at least the little paper map to create a bigger difference in values, but it is what it is. And that being said, this is one of my favorite journal pages that I think I have ever made. I think the way it is layered is super cool. I love the various pieces. We have a compass and a map to indicate travel. We have collected leaves and flowers. Also, I was really excited because I, for a very long time, have been wanting to use these little nature art prints on vellum paper, but because Inkashi's campaign is set in a desert, temperate forest river series don't exactly suit her journal. So again, I was super glad to be able to use them in Fing's journal. But this is the part that I saw in other journals that I wanted to emulate. They have a cutout of a person where their body is sticking out of a frame of some sorts, and I just thought, how cool would this be with a knight? In my weird little stash of papers, I didn't have a lot of frame-like pages, but I did find this mini star chart with little cherub iconography around it, and I thought, you know, cherubs are very thematically religious for a paladin, and the blue offers a little bit of a halo highlight for our paladin in the center. But of course, after a relatively successful page, I had to have a page that was an absolute struggle bus. This is just the way of things. This is balance in the world. I was kind of impatient with this page, and I also tried to make myself do another relatively complicated watercolor piece, knowing full well that the papers in this journal are not intended to hold watercolor in the way that watercolor paper does. It gets me every time, because I remember when I was standing in the craft store aisle, I was narrowing down which book I was going to buy, and the watercolor journals were just so darn expensive, and I ended up talking myself out of getting a watercolor specific book because I was like, I won't be using watercolor that much. Terrible foresight on my part. But I really wanted a page dedicated to evenings spent with the paladins around a campfire under the stars. Fing is writing about his growing friendship and experiences with this group of people that has taken him in, and also there are little notes left by the paladins for him in his journal. Most of the pages that I make in this video are all in reference to Fing growing and learning, where he's between the ages of 4 and 5, and I really speedrun his learning during this year. Fing canonically draws very well during the campaign, but on the other hand, he has never really had proper writing or art making tools until he met the paladin. His first ever drawing is very childish, and he has 1 year to turn into basically Leonardo da Vinci. It's a stretch. It's a pretty big stretch, but I kind of justify this by saying that from the ages of 4 to 5, kobolds are going from like 10 in human years to 18. So that's a lot of growth. That's a lot of brain development in that time. It's totally possible. Also, yes, I did end up cutting out yet another taupe piece of paper to rewrite Fing's journal entry on. The collage page next to this page just had so much brown. It felt very unbalanced in terms of color and design, so I just rewrote what I had already written just on a brown piece of paper. Speaking of concerns regarding journal cohesion and color design, this page is once again completely different. I am preparing this entry for a fun and funky fresh full page of watercolors. It's at this point in Fing's backstory that the paladins begin teaching him their trades, specifically various fighting techniques. They want to teach Fing how to defend himself as their concerns for his safety in traveling with them grows. I like to think that there was maybe an artist or two in their group who helped Fing draw various fighting poses to study, and as a bonus, I got to do some fun figure practices as well, because that's something that I need to do in general at all. Throughout all of the pictures that I draw of his paladin companions, they're either very loosely rendered, drawn without defining features, or they're wearing helmets. Because I didn't actually ever come up with names or appearances for any of these paladin characters, I actually ended up joining this campaign late. It's not that I was rushed to create a character or backstory, but I was really nervous to dive right into world building since I knew literally nothing about the world, and I was also very aware that the campaign had been going on for a couple months already. I didn't want to assume too much on my part or create a backstory that was inflexible with the current events of the universe that the game master had created. For page 7, I wanted to put another little collage and written entry from Fing, so of course, as with all collages, we went through a process of a little more trial and error, just testing various colors out, trying to be a little more careful with the way the values layered. I found one of my vellum nature papers had a winter scenery, and I love that. It's another hint of the passage of time. Also, in weathering these papers, I do a lot of the same things with watercolor that I did with Inkashi's journal, but I chose to make these stains a little more green than brown because Fing is just in a completely different environment than Inkashi. He's interacting with moss and grass and things like that. I am also indicating the passage of time by no longer writing for Fing with my left hand. I'm still purposefully trying to make the words a little uneven, but not having spelling mistakes or spacing issues and using more complex sentences. Pre-teen handwriting vibes. In all of his entries, I start by writing, "My name is Fing," kind of like a Dear Diary, because he's really only had his name for not even a year, and he's pretty excited about it. In this entry, he writes about how his paladin friends bought him a little wooden training sword, and how someday he wants to carry around a real sword just like they do. I also put a secret letter from his paladin friends underneath his entry, basically saying, with great power comes great responsibility, and how they hope he never has need of a real sword. And now, for page 8, confronting the unfortunate reality of Fing's life and why he's no longer traveling the world at the side of his paladin companions. They have all met a very tragic fate, just barely having spent any time with them at all. He loses all of them to a horrible darkness. A creature, a person, Fing is not sure, only that he crawls out of hiding to be met with his first found family, strewn about, motionless and silent. You might not be able to tell by my haphazard scribbling, but these pages were very scary to commit to. It's a full 2 pages, it's covered in scribbles. I had to consider what would go on the opposite side of these pages very carefully because I knew that I would be using just so much ink. I assumed that the pages would all bleed. I also ripped out several pages in between these two because I wanted to indicate struggle and time passing, and I was terrified that this was going to mess up the binding, but the scribbling was a little cathartic. It was a little fun, I'm not gonna lie. This turning point in Fing's life is really what I wanted to get to when I came to this video. A lot of time has passed over the pages in this video, and I would have loved to have tons of those kindergarten style journal entries at the start of things, and realistically Fing would have had probably a whole journal full of pressed flowers, adventures. It would all be written down at this point, and I thought maybe I should rip more pages out in between entries, but again, I was really nervous about ruining the binding. But the biggest reason that I didn't want to have a whole journal dedicated to just his backstory is because I have so much to cover in regards to actual campaign sessions, so many ideas. It just feels a little unfair to spend a disproportionately long amount of time on the backstory part of things when there is so much adventure to look forward to. Speaking of looking forward to adventures, this is not the end of the story for our little friend. Fing spends the next few days burying and holding ceremonies for each of his companions, and after his work is finished, he takes on the oath in the beginning of his little paladin journal to a kingdom he's never been to a deity he's never learned about. And I think I said it in my first video about Fing, but the reason I did this is because I crave at least a little bit of moral flexibility in all of my characters, and oftentimes paladins end up being these very rigid, lawful characters that are fully confident in their morals because of the oaths that they've taken. But Fing's situation allows him, and more honestly me, that flexibility in not fully understanding all the aspects of the oath that he's taken, and his commitment being more of very genuine and wholehearted promise to defend his friends and those he finds worthy of his loyalty. Also, check this out, I filmed it because I found it funny. Get ironed. Actually the watercolor was warping the paper to a point where I was worried that it wouldn't stick flat to my page, and in case you didn't know, as long as you do it on a very low heat and very carefully, you can iron paper. Just be careful that you don't have any plastic or stickers or anything like that on your page, because believe it or not, those don't iron super good. But I adore this page. I was really excited to make him a halo of yellow and orange flowers, like a radiant crown that you might see in a lot of religious iconography. I have him emerging from the darkness because I found out that I do actually have a paper that is actually dark brown and not just a middle of the road dusty color. On this very last page, I used more flower halos, vellum paper. This one depicts a sunrise, I think. I felt like dawns and new beginnings go very hand in hand, even though I pretty much immediately covered it up with more paper and stickers. But I wanted these pages to feel very colorful and hopeful after a previous page of darkness and scribbles and chaos. But this brings us to the end of Fing's backstory, so now I think it's time for the reveal. In a time not so long ago, in a place not so far from our own as one might think, in the northwestern corner of Aranset is a kingdom called Caritania, from which hails a group of brave paladins sworn to their crown, to law, to loyalty, to courage, and to responsibility. This story is not about these paladins, but rather the little bright yellow kobold they found alone and shivering on the side of the mountain pass. "Oh, you poor little Fing," they said, and in that moment his name was decided on.
My name is Fing. I am 4 years old, and I travel with paladins from Caritania.
Fing was a little older than most kobolds are when they learn to read and write common, but he was a very quick study, and he picked up on his lessons as readily as his paladin companions were willing to deliver them. Despite the successes and pride they had in their little yellow friend, there was a growing concern for Fing's safety, as his self-preservation instincts were not particularly sharp. But he loved and respected and looked up to his paladin companions. They were not just his teachers, not just his protectors, they were his new family. Together they traveled eastward through the Carrick Mountains, forging flowing rivers, climbing steep cliff faces. The travel by day was long and arduous, but Fing's friends made sure he was safe every step of the way. At nightfall, the groups would pile into heaps of furs and wool blankets, huddling near a fire under a moonlit sky. They would share warm, spiced food and fantastic stories, and Fing would practice his writing skills while listening to the many heroic deeds of his companions and those that came before them. Between Fing's many requests to be strong like his friends and the paladin's growing concerns for the little kobold's safety, they began to teach the pocket-sized draconic how to defend himself in case of an emergency. Fing readily absorbed all the training and information he was given. He was even gifted his own little wooden training sword, a testament to the faith his paladin family had in him. Fing longed for the day when he would be strong enough to carry a real sword, and his friends prayed that the day would never come that he would need to use one. But those fated to be adventurers are rarely destined for perfectly happy lives. Fing was pushed by his companions into hiding, and his small frame trembled as he waited for the clanging of metal and gnashing of teeth to end. And he waited and waited for his paladin friends to come fetch him after the victory. The noises stopped, and all was silent, but his friends never came. For the second time in his life, Fing was alone. And for the first time in his life, Fing felt the true weight of responsibility. But, luckily, this is not where Fing's story ends. With the repetition of funeral rites as his ceremony, surrounded by the graves he made for his friends, he took an oath of law, of loyalty, of courage, and of responsibility, and he swore that he would never be weak enough to let this happen again. And someone smiled on him, and felt the pureness and intensity of the flame in the little kobold's heart, and chose him to be their paladin. And that is just the beginning. As for what lies next for our little kobold friend, well, who knows? Not me.